Today we begin a study in the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel begins with a headline. Will you join me in chapter 1, verse 1, where it says, "In the year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands." The book of Daniel begins with a headline. Now, I'll give you, it's a wordy headline. It's a headline that's too long, but it is a headline. A good headline is going to tease you with the who, what, when, and where. And it's going to tease you so it'll get you to read the why inside the article. So this has those questions being answered. You've got Jerusalem is where this is happening, okay? And what happened is the king of Babylon came and attacked and besieged the city of Jerusalem. Now, to besiege a city meant that you actually surrounded it, you shut it off from all of its supplies, and you had them sit there until they either came out and fought, or they gave up and they surrendered, or they sat there long enough to die. So that's what happened. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, surrounds the city of Jerusalem to the point where they end up waving the white flag, they surrender, and they become essentially an occupied country, a subjected state to the Babylonian Empire. Now, that headline would have been incredibly big news and incredibly bad news in that time in that part of the world. If you were part of God's people, to hear that Jerusalem is fallen, it would be breaking news coming across the bottom of your screen. It would be an enormous, huge headline. But great headlines tell you the who, what, when, and where, and get you to read the article to find out the why. But here's the problem with the book of Daniel, is that if we dive into it and just keep going, we won't know all that led up to this moment where Jerusalem falls. We won't know the why of what's been happening through all these centuries that led to this moment, because there is a big backstory to what we just read in verses 1 and 2. So what is the backstory to the fall of Jerusalem? For us to understand what's happening in the book of Daniel, we've got to go way back and catch up to the story of what's happening when Jerusalem falls. What's led to the moment when Jerusalem was besieged and conquered by the Babylonian Empire. Now, this story, this backstory, it actually begins with a promise. In 2100 BC, somewhere around there, God called a man named Abram. He called a man named Abram to do something for him, to be set apart by him, to be a part. Now, Abram had grown up in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. You know it well, right? They have a great Wawa there, Ur of the Chaldeans. This is actually over in ancient Mesopotamia. And his father Terah had left Ur. He had moved up to Haran. And then God came to Abram somewhere around 2100 BC and said this, Genesis 12:1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great. And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. And him who dishonors you will be cursed. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." This is called the Abrahamic covenant. This is God making a covenant with a man named Abram to do something amazing in his family. God is promising him both legacy and land. And he's making a promise here. It's a little thinly veiled, but knowing the end of the story, he's making a promise to send Jesus. This, all the nations of the world will be blessed through you, is actually he's talking about Jesus. So God tells Abram, start traveling and I'll tell you when to stop. Now, those of you who've ever been in charge of a vacation for the family, if like you're the planner, you know where you're going and what it costs and what you're doing, that stresses you out, doesn't it? Like, just get in the car and start driving and I'll tell you when to stop. They didn't have a cars, they packed up the camels, they packed up the tents, and they started traveling till God said stop. And in Genesis 13, God said stop when they reached the land of Canaan. Verse 13, the Lord said to Abram, "Lift up your eyes and look at the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, your offspring could also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." God took this man named Abram, first from Ur of the Chaldeans up to Haran. Then he said, start traveling and I'll tell you when to stop. And he brings him down to a place called Canaan. the promised land. You can see the map of this movement that would have happened of Abram going from Ur of the Chaldeans, moving to Haran with his father, and then God saying, keep moving and keep going. You're not there yet. Keep going. Okay, now stop. Now look around. Everything you see, everything the light touches, right? Everything that you can see, it's going to be yours. And it's not only going to be yours, it's going to go to your descendants forever. There's only one problem. Abram had no kids. He's around 90 years old when this happens, I think. No, sorry, 75 years old when this happens. 75 years old. He has no children, and yet God's going to make his descendants like the dust of the earth. Well, there's this long wait from 75 years old to where God actually fulfills this promise. There's this long wait, and God actually changes his name from Abram to Abraham. And Abraham means father of many, which at the time he didn't have one, right? So it's sort of an odd name to change it to. Changes his wife's name from Sarai to Sarah. When Abram was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, God gave him a son, Isaac. I don't know about you, the thought of diapers at 100. I guess they were built a little different than us at that point, right? God made a promise to Abraham. He made a promise to send him to a land. He gave him a promise that he would have a legacy, that coming behind him would be a great nation. And through that nation, all the world would be blessed. God made those same promises to his son Isaac. In chapter 26 of Genesis, God said, I will be with you and I'll bless you. For you and your offspring, I will give all these lands. I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. To Abraham, God makes a promise. To Isaac, he makes a promise. And then to Isaac's son, Jacob, God makes a promise, saying, behold, says the Lord, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. There's this ongoing generational promise that God has given to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, that their descendants will not only have this legacy of a nation that will come from them, that all the nations of the world will be blessed through their descendants, but that they will receive the promised land provided by God, not just to Abraham, but to his descendants. Now, Jacob has 12 sons, and if you think your family has drama, read about Jacob and his family. There's a lot of drama in Jacob's family, culminating in Jacob's brothers who hated Jacob's sons, hated Jacob's favorite son, Joseph. They all couldn't stand him because he was clearly the favorite. Coat of many colors. They said, you know what? Let's get rid of him. They sold their brother into slavery. Like a wedgie seems pretty mild at this point, right? They sold their brother into slavery in Egypt, and Joseph is ripped from the family. Jacob thinks he's dead. He's taken to Egypt. He's sold into slavery. He's there for a long time, ends up in prison, and yet in all that, what his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good, because he took Joseph from the promised land to Egypt. And in Egypt, he was placed there to be restored from the jail, be restored from the depths, and be restored back to a position of promise. He ends up being second in the land and leading Egypt and being prepared for a global famine, and he was able to essentially be used by God to save the world. His family ends up coming and finding food and safety in Egypt. They settle in the land of Goshen, and on Joseph's mind, at the end of a life that was truly monumental, what's on his mind is the promises that God had made to his forefathers. Look at Genesis 50:24. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you, and he'll bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. On his mind, as he's breathing his last, is the faithful promises of God that were made to generation after generation after generation. Now, Joseph dies. There arises a Pharaoh in the years to come that doesn't remember Joseph, doesn't remember how faithful Joseph had been. And there's this Pharaoh that rises, and he ends up hating the people who had descended from Jacob and his sons and all their families. And he puts them into slavery. For 400 years, God's people are slaves in the land of Egypt, serving a Pharaoh who hates them. And God, in the midst of that story, there's a baby born who's saved from certain death by being placed in a basket in the river, in the Nile. God not only saves Joseph, later on in the story, he sends Joseph to go to Pharaoh, to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Let God's people be free from slavery. And Pharaoh says no. 10 plagues later, one of them being death of the firstborn, Pharaoh actually says, yes, you can go. So God's faithful through all of that story, those 10 plagues. So around 1450 BC, the Exodus occurs. God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. He rescued them at the Red Sea when their back was to the water and their face was filled with the chariots of Pharaoh's army. God split the Red Sea and allowed them to walk across on dry land. He meets them in the wilderness at Mount Sinai to deliver his law, to deliver his word, to deliver the way they should live, how God's people, his chosen nation, should live in light of the God who set them apart and the God who rescued them. And God, as he's interacting with Moses, as they finish up at Mount Sinai, getting the law, Exodus 33, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. Generation after generation, God is repeating a promise. He's repeating a generational promise to the people that he's set apart from the rest of the world. And as they travel through the wilderness, as they travel, getting closer and closer to the promised land, they get on the verge of the land that had been promised to their forefathers. 400 years in slavery, living under the thumb and the boot of Pharaoh. They are about to be free and in the land that was promised to their forefathers. And they send 12 spies into the land. 2 come back with a positive report saying the land is everything that God said it was. Let us go and take what the Lord has promised. But 10 of them came back going, the walls are big, the cities are big, the soldiers are big. There's no way this can happen. They doubted God. And God said, really? I've been faithful from generation to generation, and you're going to doubt me? Okay, this generation, you're not going to see the promised land. You're going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and the next generation, they're the ones who will see the promised land. So 40 years later, they're wandering. Everyone's died off except for Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies who brought back the positive report. Joshua is now taken over for Moses. They're coming into the promised land. The Lord parts the Jordan River for this huge million-plus nation now, million-plus people nation to walk across the Jordan River into the promised land. The Jordan River parts, Jericho falls, and God delivers the promised land to his people. Throughout the book of Joshua, we see the people claiming peace after peace after peace of the promised land. And in Joshua 21, it says this, thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all of their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Don't miss this. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Not one word of God's promises had failed to come to pass. And they all lived happily ever after. And we know that's not true because of the headline in Daniel 1, right? So what in the world happened from God being faithful to fulfill every word of his promises to the headline that Jerusalem is falling? What happened in the interim between those two things? Well, it doesn't take a long time for the problems to develop, for things to start to fall apart. You have this period between Joshua and the kings called the Judges period, where during the Judges period you see this cycle of behavior happen among God's people. Judges 2:11 says, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. What that means is they worshiped other idols. The whole book of Judges is 400 years of the people doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord goes, okay, you're not listening to me. You're not paying attention. I've been faithful. You're being faithless. I'm going to allow a people to come in and conquer you. They come in and conquer you. The people go, oh, Lord, why have you abandoned us? What in the world have you done? God raises up a judge to set them free, to rescue them. The people do good as long as that judge lives. Then that judge dies, and then the very next chapter you'll read, and the people did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Cycle after cycle, cycle after cycle. cycle after cycle for 400 years. The last judge in this line is a man by the name of Samuel. He was not only judge of the nation, leading and ruling over them, but he was also a priest. Samuel was the last judge. And during that time, God's people came to Samuel and they said, we look around and we're not like the rest of the nations. You see, the rest of the nations around them all had kings. And they wanted a king too. Here's the problem. It said very clear in Moses' teaching. When Moses was telling the people of Israel what they were supposed to be, how they were supposed to live, God was to be their king. But they said, okay, yeah, that's all fine and dandy, but look, everybody else has got a king. We want to be like everybody else. So God said, sure, I'll give you a king. He gives them King Saul somewhere around 1040 BC. Saul is crowned king of Israel. God gives them a king who's kind of after their hearts. Then Saul leads them astray. Saul's not a good man. Saul is a wicked man. And God ends up giving the kingdom not to Saul's descendants, but to David's descendants, a man after God's own heart. And one of David's descendants is a man named Solomon, who's going to have to take over for David, this great warrior, poet, king, big shoes to fill. And God comes to Solomon and he says, what in the world do you want? I'll give you anything that you want. You're about to take over for your father David. You're about to rule and lead my people. What do you want? Solomon says, give me wisdom. And he's recorded in Scripture as basically the wisest man who ever lived. And yet, somewhere along the way, he exchanged wisdom for foolishness. How can I make so clear a statement? He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The very definition of foolishness is looking at your spouse and going, life would be so much better if I had 999 more of him or her, right? That is just not smart. His foolishness not only sort of wrecked himself and sort of wrecked his home and his palace. You can imagine the tension in a house full of 700 wives and 300 concubines. But he actually brought into the country pagan leaders' children. He brought in the daughters of pagan leaders, and they brought their practices with them. He poisoned the people. He inherited the promise, the legacy, and the land, and he brought in pagan practices and pagan worship. And in the very next generation, 930 BC, the kingdom divided. Northern kingdom to the north of 10 tribes called Israel. Southern kingdom to the south of 2 tribes, nations called Judah. And there were kings of the north. These kings of the northern kingdom, there's a bunch of them. You'll see them on the screen. Most of them will be names you probably don't recognize. You may at least recognize Ahab, King Ahab, and his wife, Queen Jezebel. There's this whole list of kings, and you can read it in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles about what happened in the northern kingdom under all these kings. And they have one thing in common. Every single one of them did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They were all evil. Some of the worst stuff you can ever think of was happening in the northern kingdom of Israel. 10 tribes of God-chosen people who are the inheritors of legacy and land, who are saying, who's God? We want nothing to do with him. Where's the Baal that I can bow to? Now, around 721 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered and taken captive by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire comes in, wipes them out, takes them captive, disperses them amongst the empire, really to never return as they were. Those 10 tribes are essentially dispersed. They never come back to the promised land as constituted before. But Judah's still there. Northern kingdom wiped out. Kings all gone. People dispersed. Judah's still there. Kings of the southern kingdom. Long list of those. You had some who were good. You had some who started good and ended bad. You had some who started bad and ended good. You had a lot of them that were just plain bad the whole time. You had this mixed bag of leaders in the southern kingdom. And the kings led their people, in particular near the end of the time that we're talking about, leading up to Daniel 1, you had many who were just leading them to do what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And in spite of all of these sins, in spite of all the ways that God's people have gone, we know you were faithful then, God. We're going to do what we want now. In spite of all that, God kept sending his prophets to speak into his people, to warn his people, like the prophet Jeremiah who wrote this, "Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for you all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord. And for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring against this land and its inhabitants and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction, and I will make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. Verse 11, this whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. For 23 years, Jeremiah is delivering these messages to God's people, and they didn't listen once. For 23 years, he's bringing words of warning that guys, if you don't change what you're doing, here's what's God's going to happen. It isn't like God's going, you're in for it. He tells you, I'm going to raise up this king. I'm going to raise up this empire. He's going to invade. He's going to wipe everything out, and you're going to get 70 years of exile with him. And the people heard it, and they went, you know what? Let's beat Jeremiah. They did. Let's throw him in a cistern. They did that, this big well of water. They threw him in there. They put him in stocks in the public square, and they placed him in jail. They did everything except listening to the warnings of God, telling them to turn from their sins. So, in 605 BC, God followed through with his punishment. Let's go back to Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. This headline, beyond what we read at the beginning, it actually gets even worse. Tragic moment. For 800 years, God's people have lived in the land and legacy of God's promise. For 800 years, God had been faithful to deliver what he had promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And now they've been ripped from their homeland. They've not only been defeated, they have subjected Yahweh to mockery. They allowed the vessels that were used in the temple. Solomon's temple still existed at this time. They had allowed the gold and silver vessels that were used as articles of worship within the temple. They allowed them to be taken as ransom or taken as treasure from God's house and taken and placed in the temple of a pagan god. We have to think about why in the world in 2100 BC did God look over all the earth and go to a man named Abram and say, I'm choosing you. And I'm choosing your descendants. I'm setting you apart from the rest of the nations to do something special in you. Why did he pick them? There's nothing in the story. Like Abram just shows up. It doesn't even say Abram was a righteous man above all others. It says that about other people. It doesn't say it about Abram. He just calls him out. There's no merit to Abram or to his people of why he called them out. But why, not just like the purpose of him calling it, like what was the evidence that God saw? There was no evidence that God saw. God just chose to use them. What was the purpose of them being chosen? The purpose of them being chosen is that the glory of God, the power of God could be seen by the world in his relationship to his people. The people of Israel were set apart to tell the world of the greatness and the goodness of their God. That's why they were chosen. And by generations of going, thanks but no thanks. Thanks for the promised land. We're loving the place you picked out for us, but no thanks to worshiping you. Thanks for your provision. You will not get our allegiance. Thanks for all you've done. We're going to go our own way. The people of Israel were set apart to tell the world about the greatness and the goodness of God, but because of their ongoing generational sins, the people of Israel brought dishonor in the name of the one who kept every last word of the promises that he'd made. He kept every last word of his promises, and yet they kept none. We must remember this headline is not just something that affects kings. This is not just something that affects cities and walls and gates. There are people in the wake of this moment. Look at verse 3. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. and they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. When Judah was defeated, it began the first of 3 deportations where a significant number of the people of Judah were killed. A significant number of the people of Judah were taken captive. They were taken as slaves. They were taken from their home to a foreign land. And in this first one, in 605, there's a number of them taken. There's another one, I think, in like 597. And then in 586, they don't cover it in the book of Daniel, but we can see the Babylonians come back, and this time they wipe out everybody. The gates are torn down. The walls are destroyed. The temple is destroyed. And the people are destroyed. In this first deportation, though, Babylon took the best and the brightest from Judah. Imagine that God coming into a high school and taking all the honor students and the great musicians and the great athletes and the great actors, the best-looking people, came out and pulled the top 30% of that community. That's what happened. People from about 14 to 17-year-old. Picture about high school students being ripped from their homeland, being ripped from their families, and dragged to a foreign land. This was not an odd thing to happen with a conquered people, because it was a way of capturing the next generation, indoctrinating them into the empire's culture and beliefs and knowledge, and they would eventually come back and rule the land that had been occupied. Now, in this first deportation, they took the best and brightest, ripped from the promised land, and they bring them from Jerusalem, and they bring them back over to where they are. Look at this map. Does that look kind of familiar to you? 605 BC. The people, the descendants, people who had descended from Abraham, the people of the promise, the people who had inherited the legacy of a nation that would bless all nations, people who had inherited a land that had been promised by God and delivered miraculously by God. They are ripped from the homeland, and they're sent basically back to where the story began. Because his descendants refused to follow God, because the descendants of Abraham refused to listen to God, the best and the brightest were right back where the story began. And where does that leave us? Look at verse 6. It says, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. We know the names of 4 teens, 4 teenagers. Some of you have teenagers, or you are a teenager, or at once you were a teenager. Can you imagine 14 to 17-year-old ripped from your homeland, 3 years of training to be a part of another culture, a culture that had wiped out your people? And now you are in a foreign land, ripped from your homeland, enslaved in a distant land, living in a culture that rejects everything you believe, hates everything you valued. They even changed their names. I find it interesting. The names of the people we know from the book of Daniel that are in the wake of this moment, the wake of this headline. They're people, they weren't alive to hear the promises of God to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They never saw Joseph lead the world to health and survival in a famine. They never heard Moses confront Pharaoh. They never doubted God could deliver his people when the spies came back from the promised land. And they weren't there to forget God when another judge came and went. They never asked for a king to rule them instead of their God being their king. And they never agreed for the kingdom to be divided. And yet they found themselves as slaves living in a strange land, serving the first years of 70 years of exile for generations of sin. Over the next several weeks, we're going to study the book of Daniel. We're going to study the book of Daniel in 2 parts. First part is chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 1 through 6 is written mostly in Aramaic, which is the language of the Babylonians. Oddly enough, it ends up being the language that Jesus would have spoken in most day-to-day encounters because they brought it back with them from their 70 years of exile, brought it back, and it kind of stuck. When Jesus is on the cross and he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, he's actually speaking Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of it's written in Hebrew. And that first chapters 1 through 6 is really the narrative about Daniel and his friends and what it's like to live in this foreign culture and try and live by faith. Then, chapters 7 through 12 sort of change gears. It's mostly Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic, and it's more about prophecies about the future, even prophecies of the end times. We're going to go through this book in 2 sermon series. One book, 2 sermon series. The first one is what we're doing now. We're going to do that before Easter, conviction and compromise. And the second part we're going to do after Easter, looking at prophecies and promises. And Daniel is an ancient book, though, with a timely message. It's a book about how to live with faith in a fallen world, how to live with conviction in a world that is pressuring you to compromise. You know, sometimes we read the headlines of the world and the time we live in, and they're not good headlines. They're a little bit like verse 1 of Daniel. Headlines that make us anxious, headlines that make us worried, headlines that shake us to our core, headlines that make us wonder, God, where have you gone? God, are you still sovereign? God, do you still rule and reign? I want to begin the book of Daniel with some convictions that we can see from the backstory of Daniel 1, and we can see revealed in chapter 1, and convictions that I believe will guide us well as we walk through this book going forward. Here's the first one. We must not measure God's sovereignty by the state of the world. We cannot look around at the state of the world, and on good days, God's in control. And on bad days, well, looks like God lost another one. That's not how we should view the news, and that's not how we should view Scripture. God's people sinned, and their sin led to their downfall. But did you notice in verse 2 what it said? That the Lord gave them over to the Babylonians. That the Lord gave them over to the army that was coming against them. Why? Because it was their punishment. You ever had a child where you've told them 1,000 times, if you keep doing this, here's what's going to happen. And then when you do what you said you're going to do, they look at you like, what in the world? They have the gall to act surprised, right? Didn't I just tell you? Yes, you did, but I never thought you'd do it. Well, guess what? You were wrong, right? In this, we've got to see. God has said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Jeremiah, 23 years, I'm going to do this. You keep doing this. I'm going to do this. And God did it. But God was always in control. God was sovereign when he delivered the promised land to his people. And God was sovereign when he exiled his people from the promised land. They found themselves living as slaves in a strange land. And at the end of the day, God was always sovereign. And he's still sovereign today. He rules and he reigns over all things. The headlines that we love and the headlines that we hate. God is working all things for our good and for his glory if we are called according to his purpose. This is our Father's world. And when world history comes to an end, it will have told his story. It will have told it in his timing. And he will have told it for his glory. Here's the second conviction, that the state of the world reflects the combined impact of generations of sin. Judah did not reach the point of exile overnight. Why did we go back to 2100 BC and walk through all of it? Because you've got to get the severity of the sin to understand the severity of the judgment. And you've got to recognize that it was not something that happened in the last 5 minutes that led to their exile. It is something that had happened for the last hundreds of years. Judah didn't reach that point of exile overnight, and we didn't reach the point we're in our culture overnight either. It has taken a long time for things to devolve and tear down as much as they are today. We didn't get in this problem overnight. We shouldn't be shocked if it takes more than a night to fix it either. Here's the next one. Every individual in every generation has contributed their own sins to the world state. Sometimes we look at the world around us and we play the victim. We look at the world around us and we feel like, oh, woe is me that I must live in a time like this. At the end of the day, we must understand we have all contributed our portion of that sin gulf between man and God. We have all contributed our portion to this. Do we contribute the lion's share? No. Did we start it? No. Will we finish it? No. But we've all contributed something. So let's not play victims to the culture around us. Let's confess what we need to confess. Let's trust God in the midst of all of it. But let's recognize that this has been a generational process that led to the fall of Jerusalem. And it is a generational process that has led to the brokenness in our world today. And we have our part that we've contributed. Here's the next one. Daniel and his friends were caught in the wake of the consequences of generational sin. For generations, God's people had done the wrong thing. Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had lived a short life. Were they innocent? No, there are no innocent people, but they had not contributed enough to result in the exile. They were living in the wake of sins that had come before them. And as are we. We're living in the wake of decisions that came before us. And we've contributed our own decisions. But what we must recognize is this. How are we going to react in this time? What are we going to do with the world God has handed to us? Are we, more importantly, let's take it even a step further. How are we going to live differently so the generation behind us doesn't have the same mess? Are we placing for the next generation stepping stones or stumbling blocks? Are you placing for the next generation, your children and grandchildren and their children, are you placing stepping stones or stumbling blocks? Here's the next one and the last one. We cannot choose our times, but we must choose our response. Daniel and his friends did not choose to land in this place. They did not choose to land as slaves in a strange land, but they chose their response. And they lived in a way that provides a model for us in the times that we live in as well. Will our lives be marked by compromise with the culture, or will our lives be shaped by the conviction that our God reigns? The book of Daniel is not about how the world is going to finally get it right. It's about how the people of God should live in a world that's gone wrong. Martin Lloyd-Jones, great preacher and author, said this: the Christian is a man who can be certain about the ultimate, even when he's most uncertain about the immediate. What are we certain about? We are certain that our God reigns. We are certain that our God is not just a promise maker, he is a promise keeper. And we know that is true because we can fix our eyes on Jesus, the one who came and made a way where there was no way, who paid the price that we couldn't pay, who defeated sin at the cross and death at the empty tomb. We can fix our eyes on Jesus. How can we live with conviction in a world that wants us to compromise? The very first thought on our mind, the only hope in our heart, the only word on our lips, we said it a few weeks ago, will be Jesus. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word and for your love, for this book you're going to allow us to walk through to see how your people lived, how your people served in a culture that was hostile to everything about them. Lord, they're going to face worst-case scenarios, and we're going to see how they lived faithfully. More importantly, we're going to see how you rule and reign even over worst-case scenarios. Lord, I pray you would give us a heart that longs to not just embrace your promises, but to embrace our submission, to embrace your lordship, to recognize that we have been called to live a life that brings honor and glory to the promise maker and promise keeper. Lord, let us be a people who are committed to living lives of conviction in a world that would love for us to compromise. Lord, let us live lives that look like Jesus. In his name that we pray. Amen.